بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
So last time we were talking about the big kahuna from the point of view of oil wealth, 25% of all the oil on the planet, and decisions about this is made by an exceptionally peculiar nation state. We saw that this state rests on a coalition of two main groups, a ruling family and a set of Muslim clerics. We saw that the history goes back into the 18th century, starting with an expansion from this very isolated part of the Arabian Peninsula called the Najd, so isolated that historically nobody else has been interested in it, and consequently it was left pretty much alone. They expanded both towards the Persian Gulf and towards the Red Sea, where the region called the Hejaz, where there are these two sacred cities of Mecca and Medina. They were defeated. The Ottomans came back with the help of Egyptians and crushed them and dispersed them, but they returned. They returned in the early 20th century. A man named Ibn Saud left Kuwait, where he'd been living in exile, and took the capital city of Riyadh in the Najd in 1902. His enemies were allied with the Ottomans, which made him a kind of enemy of the Ottomans here on the eve of World War I. The British, because of this, tilted in his direction. Although they didn't really do very much to help him out, they used their diplomatic stuff with some assistance, but there wasn't very much. And in 1915, there was a treaty that the British signed with the Saudis, recognizing the control of King Ibn Saud of Central Arabia. They then moved on to seize the Hejaz, which at that time, remember this was before oil, was the most valuable part of the Arabian Peninsula because it has this cosmopolitan trading mercantile elite and the two holiest cities in Islam, Mecca and Medina. Now the British were not too keen on the ruling powers in that region, called the Hashemites, the Sharif Hussein, who was a nominal leader of the Arab revolt. You would see them in Lawrence of Arabia and so on. The British, you remember, wanted mandates instead. And the timing was favorable, since the British really didn't care who was in control of the Hejaz. And so Ibn Saud seized Mecca in 1924, and after a one-year siege, took the city of Medina. Like the founders of most states, he was one tough cookie. He was well over 6 feet tall, very muscular, shown here as a young man, and as you can see, this is probably not the kind of guy you would want to mess with. Upon one occasion, after finally meeting in battle in hand-to-hand combat an enemy of his, he chopped off his head and recalled in his memoirs, quote, "It was a blessed moment I kissed the sword." He was a tough guy. And notice their pattern of expansion was very similar to that in the earlier centuries. How did they do this? There were two conditions of this victory. The first, this political coalition we mentioned previously, and the presence of highly disciplined, indeed fanatical shock troops called the Ikhwan, which is simply the Arabic word for brothers. It was a brotherhood. We'll talk about them in a minute. And second, the fact that nobody else really cared. So he had a political coalition, he had highly motivated shock troops, and nobody else really cared what happened, and this helped him to win. Who were these Ikhwan? They were Wahhabi warriors, shown here in a photograph of the time, in I think about 1918. They were Bedouins, and they helped him consolidate power, but like a lot of sort of very ideologically driven people, they later get into conflict with the state, which after all has to make deals, has to make calculations, and Ibn Saud would attack them. Who were they? They were young men recently converted to this very austere interpretation of Islam. They lived in separated places so as to maintain their purity. Purity and obsessions with purity always being a danger sign in the world of fanatics. They were extreme takfiris. They thought that anybody who didn't agree exactly with their interpretation of Islam was an infidel. They wanted, for instance, to prohibit travel to such infidel countries as Kuwait, which is 100% Muslim. They rose in revolt against Saud in 1927-30, and he crushed them. But their political views have resurfaced in the late 20th century, and we'll come back to that momentarily. There have always been tensions inside this social formation that is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. On the one hand, King Saud was trying to establish a nation-state with all the usual features of a bureaucracy and an army, and therefore the need for people to train them, which requires education and so forth. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, the state's ideological foundation was a form of religiously based extremism. This contradiction has exploded several times in Saudi history. The first one was in 1927-30. A second time was a generation ago, the siege of the Grand Mosque, the holiest site in Islam, in 1979, that I'll talk about in a little bit. And last but hardly least, the struggle between Saudis in Al-Qaeda and the state itself. After all, Osama bin Laden is himself a Saudi. There's another contradiction between this ideologically puritanical regime on the one hand and huge oil rents which not only accrue to the state but accrue to a state that defines itself as a family. Okay? So you get a combination of ostentation, profligacy, indulgence, and puritanical obscurantism and intolerance. Ibn Saud himself, arguably, was something of a takfiri. He said this, that the people of Al-Hassa province on the Persian Gulf, he said, were rejectionists. That is, we forced them into Islam. Who were these people? They were Shi'i Muslims. Okay? So again, bad blood between Shi'i Muslims and the Saudi state goes back a long way and plays out in lots of different places, not just in the Persian Gulf, although it does do so there. It also plays out in Afghanistan and even more importantly, in Iraq, as we'll see. Here's a map, again, that shows, it overlays oil deposits with type of Islam, the dark green being Shi'i Islam. And notice here in Saudi Arabia, where Al-Ghawar oil field is and the main oil fields are, the majority of the population are Shi'i Muslims. They have long been oppressed, in their view, stomped on, and they are not too keen on the state. Then there is the House of Sheikh, led by this man, Sheikh bin Baz. Nobody knows exactly when he was born, but that's a good guess. He lived a very long life. He was the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia during the 1990s. He was a serious obscurantist and takfiri. For example, he issued a religious ruling disputing that the Apollo had actually landed on the moon. He rejected the rotation of the Earth. I mean, you think we have problems with people rejecting Darwin? How about rejecting Copernicus? Anyway, you get the idea about this guy. He lost status with other extremists, however, when he legitimized U.S. troops coming into Saudi Arabia during the crisis of Operation Desert Storm. The power structures of this regime show how this is a classic rentier state. Vast oil wealth comes to the state and then is used to build political alliances. Now, Saudi Arabia is a little unusual in this way because the kind of political alliances that they created were fostered in part by the existence in Islamic law of two things. One is, it's legitimate for a man to have 4 wives, and two, divorce is also legitimate. What Ibn Saud did was systematically marry women from lots of different tribes, have children with them, then divorce them so that he could then marry other women from other tribes, and in this way fathered 37 sons who in turn did something similar, such that today the ruling house of Saud, I mean, we say it's a house, it's a royal family, and we start thinking, oh, I know, that's like the United Kingdom. No, not at all like the United Kingdom. It's much more like, in terms of percentage of the population, what the percentage of population was that belonged to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union during the Soviet Union. It's a small percentage of the population, but it's maybe 1%. There are a lot of these people. Right? So it is sort of the core ruling elite. They also dispose, not only do they have all this money, they've created this social network over time, historically, they also have very significant ideological resources. They are, after all, the so-called keepers, the defenders of the two holiest sites in Islam, and in particular, the holiest site of all, Al-Masjid al-Haram, the great mosque in Mecca, with the Kaaba, the cube, which is the direction of prayer for all Muslims, shown here, thousands of people praying at night, which is a very common sight. Additionally, as we already know, this regime, so constituted with this particular and peculiar historical context, also forged a very close relationship with the United States. Ever since, as we saw before, ever since FDR met Ibn Saud in 1944, we have defined the defense of Saudi Arabia as in our national interest, and clearly we have done this because, and really almost entirely because, of oil. We also collaborated extensively with the Saudis throughout the Cold War. We were united by opposition to Marxism and to communist movements, parties, governments, and also to any form of local nationalism that both we and they thought might be a threat to our joint and several interests. The consequences of this can hardly be overstressed. As we will see, it is the origins of the global jihadi phenomenon that we cope with today. This alliance really reached its high point during Operation Desert Storm. Desert Shield first, and then Desert Storm, the actual war, when prompted by Saddam Hussein's invasion and then later his expulsion from Kuwait. Oil makes strange bedfellows, and folks stay there. It wasn't just FDR. Here's Lyndon Johnson with King Faisal, Richard Nixon with King Faisal, Ronald Reagan with King Saud, George Bush with the latest king. This is a long-standing phenomenon. And this got you a nice picture. Sometimes pictures summarize a whole course, right? Despite rhetoric, we shared important aims. We, meaning the government of the United States under George Bush, that administration. They were the oil connection, being against the left throughout the world, being against the Kyoto Protocols, being against Iran, but there were also tensions. Tensions over Israel, tensions over the Saudi promotion of various forms of very rigid interpretations of Islam, and then, of course, on the Saudi side, they were utterly appalled by our blundering and strategic stupidity in the invasion of Iraq. There's another picture that, again, sort of sums it all up. This is from 2005. Here we have the King Abdullah, George Bush Sr., Dick Cheney, and various folks virtually falling over themselves, fawning, once again, greed always wins out. Historically, we've seen this slide before, this man, Faisal, King of Saudi Arabia in that period, did a great deal to shape the modern Middle East. What was his lasting influence? First, Saudi dominance of inter-Arab politics, largely through the destruction in the June War and thereafter of the Arab nationalism of Nasser. The emergence of these global takfiri ideological networks and proselytizing, much of which was funded by the Saudis. The Islamization of the Palestinian cause. The use of the money to control and curtail criticisms of Saudi Arabia in the Arab press. This was done extensively. You can read about that in Abu Khalil's book. and this contribution to the defeat of Arab nationalism, all in strengthening the alliance with the United States. And we see now there was this conjuncture in the 1970s of the waning of Arab nationalism in '67, combined conjuncturally with this transformation of the world of cash and control in the oil business, which led to an explosion of oil rents now flowing directly into the hands of governments, one of which government was this government, with these particular interests, with this particular ideology, with this particular set of connections. King Fahd became the king after Faisal was assassinated by a widely believed to have been unbalanced relative. He wielded power for 20 years, and he was rocked right away by three big events. One, the Iranian Revolution. Two, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And three, the seizure of the Holy Mosque in Mecca. I'll talk about the first two later on. The second one probably either later today, probably later in the lecture today, but the whole and the Iran later on. But we'll talk about this the seizure of the Holy Mosque in a minute. He also expanded, which would make sense given the nature of the regime and the amount of money that he disposed of, this so-called checkbook diplomacy. To basically hand out money. In other words, you recapitulate what you've done domestically by using oil wealth to build constituencies. You do that on an international scale. You hand out money to this government or that foreign actor or this foreign actor as a way to try to get them to support you. And you continue to fund this various kinds of missionary activity. He also embodied that contradiction, which was he was a high roller. He lived very well, to put it very mildly. This was widely regarded as scandalous. And this is a recurring contradiction that is really built into the nature of the Saudi state. This contradiction between the lavishness of a familial dynasty disposing of these kinds of oil rents on the one hand, with the temptations that offers, and on the other hand, an ideology that stresses a highly puritanical interpretation of Islam. This is a poor fit, and dissidents in the Saudi Arabia of all types agree that the regime is corrupt, and the Takfiris are particularly vociferous about this, bin Laden leading the charge. What is this structural corruption? The state, that's us. I mean, Louis XIV of France said, the state, that's me. In the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, it should be the plural. The state, that's us, meaning this House of Saud, this vast network of princes in the state. You remember we talked a bit about, in European history, the transformation of sovereignty from a familial base, like the Ottomans or the Habsburgs or the Romanovs, to modern nation states. Interestingly, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is not like that. After all you need to know is the name itself. It is a state that is named after a family. That's what Saudi means. Okay? It means Saudi. It means sons of Ibn Saud. Okay? It's a family name. It would be as if we called the United States, we called it the United States of Obama. We don't call it that. Okay? We didn't call it the United States of Bush Cheney. Maybe we should have, but we didn't. Okay? So this is a fundamental difference in the nature of the state. Okay? Saudi Arabia. There's little distinction made between the public finances on the one hand and the incomes of the royal family. Some estimates, these vary widely. The real truth is nobody knows. But some estimates go up to 30% of oil rents basically going into the pockets of the royal family. And remember, this is a very large group of people. Most of these are men, they are largely men, that we have never heard of. But they're vastly wealthy, and they are technically private actors. They can take their wealth and do whatever they want to with it, include, as many of them do, because they're private and they have this wealth, include funding people whose politics they like, which are often politics that we don't like so much at all. Okay? Now, there were some early warning signs about this contradiction. This contradiction surfaced right after the American hostage crisis in Tehran during the Iranian Revolution. We were very distracted. We Americans didn't notice this much at all, but it happened. There was, armed with rifles that were smuggled in coffins, a group of extremists got into the great mosque in Mecca, and they took it over, and they proclaimed this. It was an end times concept, the coming of the Mahdi, the end of time, and now everyone should turn towards God, and the rulers were corrupt, and they should be overthrown, and everyone should rise up. Well, this was, to put it mildly, a gigantic scandal in the kingdom. And it was led by someone hardly anyone had ever heard of, a man named Juhayman al-Utaibi, and he proclaimed jihad against the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, among other people. Okay? This siege lasted for 2 weeks, and you can see why. It was completely, to put it mildly, you can't just blow up the building. And it sort of would be like if armed fanatics seized St. Peter's in Rome. What do? You can't exactly bomb it. You can't exactly bring in heavy artillery. As we'll see, they did something else. What they actually did, although they couldn't talk about it because technically non-Muslims are not supposed to be in Mecca, it's widely believed they brought in French commandos who helped show the local security forces how best to get rid of them. But it took a long time. They had to take time because of the sacredness of the site, and they couldn't just blow it up, which then meant that the crisis sort of kept on going and became more visible and more people knew about it. Who was this guy? Who was this crazy guy? Well, he was a classic Wahhabi, Takfiri views. He opposed these evils, radio, television, employment of women, all the usual. He was an extreme Takfiri. He pronounced Saudi Arabia itself a Takfiri state, a non-Muslim state, a really seriously deranged notion. And they finally got him and immediately chopped off his head as well as the head of everybody else. Many think so that there wouldn't be any more talk. No more talk, just kill him. That's what they did. The regime's response politically was to grant even greater authority to the religious authorities, and this, remember, is in 1979 on the eve of the explosion of Afghanistan. And we'll come back to that in a bit. He was a homegrown revolutionary. He was born and raised in one of those settlements set up by the Ikhwan to promote purity. He studied theology under Sheikh bin Baz, he of the rejection of Copernicus fame. Bin Baz agreed with much of what Utaibi said, but there were two things that he couldn't agree with him. This end times concept, which for Wahhabis is rather heretical, and his disobedience to the House of Saud. This revolt remains to this day an inspiration for Al-Qaeda. This stuff goes back quite a while. Here's a photograph from the time, probably smuggled out by the French, showing one of the minarets, the huge minarets in the Masjid al-Haram, smoke rising from it as an attempt to put it down. The Saudis continued checkbook diplomacy. They have and had very limited military capacities. Indeed, when I was in Cairo during Operation Desert Storm, the United States Marines referred to the Saudi troops as quote-unquote speed bumps. They buy huge amounts of arms from the United States, but this is mainly a way to please the Americans. They use this money, which include these various things, and they have done this for a long time. So, understanding the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is crucial to understanding the whole story, complicated, twisted, conjunctural, contingent, that is the story of blood and oil. And a major case in point is Afghanistan. And understanding this, of course, for us Americans today, is absolutely essential. Afghanistan is famously referred to as the place where empires go to die. Here we have the British coming in the 19th century. We'll talk about what happened to some of them. Here are the Soviets in the 1980s, and here are we today. Let's think about this. First, the prologue. Lord Roberts, so-called of Kandahar, given this title by the Queen of England, said, "We have nothing to fear from Afghanistan, provided we simply leave them alone. The less they see of us, the better they will like us," or probably, he says it better, the less they will dislike us. Barnett Rubin, probably the greatest living American analyst of Afghanistan, whose book, The Fragmentation of Afghanistan, is crucial for really an in-depth understanding of this country, had this to say in terms of general perspectives on Afghanistan. we will see that in many, 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 many ways, Afghanistan seems primitive. It seems backward. It seems undeveloped. And in some ways, and by some definitions, it would be reasonable to use all of those adjectives. And yet, it did not get that way in a vacuum. It got that way very much because of interaction with superpowers and the most powerful folks in the world. We Americans tend not to pay attention to this. But then again, we tend not to pay attention to all kinds of things. We tend not to pay attention to one of the greatest American diplomats ever, George Kennan, who wrote way back in 1949, when I was 3 years old. He had this to say, right? The problems of the world are more stubborn than we think. How about a little simple economics? How about economizing on our resources and trying to apply them where we feel they will do the most good? We'll see that that may not include Afghanistan, because when you start analyzing Afghanistan using the basic analytical devices that we've been looking at in this course, you can see how very difficult the situation is. You can understand in a way why there really is no quote-unquote solution to any of this. How is that? Let's look at some key features. Go all the way back. We need to talk about the nature of state formation, the nature of society, the nature of outsiders, the Janus-based nature of the state. All of these themes will weave in and out as we look at the history of Afghanistan. So it's those basic themes in an extremely unpleasant environment. First, it is very mountainous, a land of mountains and deserts. It therefore has always been a land split up, fissiparous society, split up into lots and lots and lots and lots of different places. There are things called tribes, there are ethnic groups, and there is one unifying factor, but which often becomes a disunifying factor, the role of Islam. The state has always been weak in Afghanistan. This then means, since it has some strategic location, at least people think this from time to time, that outsiders have always played a role episodically. One phrase from Barnett Rubin is that we have not only the phenomenon of the rentier state, yes we do, but we also have the opposition to the state being equally dependent on outside funding. Rentier state, rentier revolutionaries. Some of this, a good deal of this, flows simply from the geography of the place. It's landlocked, therefore no coast. Therefore, under pre-industrial, pre-fossil fuel conditions, really not much trade to speak of. It's arid, which means the people are spread out. Irrigated agriculture is possible in limited areas, typically along water courses and rivers. But this meant limited surpluses, whether from farms or from cities, which meant limited tax revenue for the state, which of course means a weak state and increased power of local authorities. So what it looks like, these are deserts here and here. These are all mountains interspersed with valleys. It is a most inhospitable place for anyone trying to create a central state. Which doesn't mean that it hasn't been tried repeatedly. And of course, that dynamic of attempts to create a central state and then its resistance by local authorities is a theme that we've seen over and over again historically. And looking at that in the specific case of Afghanistan, I think will be fairly illuminating. State formation, because of this lack of resources internally, has in some ways always been outsider determined. The very borders of the country were determined by outsiders. Its independent existence itself was determined by outsiders, and the state has always depended to some extent on external aid. These outsiders, however, are various. There are lots of them, and their interests clash. In the 19th century, as we'll see, it was the British against the Russians. During the Cold War, it was the Americans versus the Soviets. Today, we have the Pakistanis against the Indians, the Iranians against the Saudis, not to mention the Chinese and the Russians, all of whom have strategic interests for reasons of history and geography in that particular area, and then throw in clueless Americans, and you can imagine what we get. Here's a recurring theme we'll see throughout 200 years of Afghan history. Loss of external revenue, it's where it comes from. Well, what happens? It gets cut off. When the external revenue dries up, the central state weakens. What happens then? Local powers get stronger. What do? Do they get along? Oh no, they don't. They fight. And this leads to a rise in conflict. And you can see this kind of cycle. That rise in conflict in turn often tempts outsiders to intervene. They give wealth. The state gets a little stronger. But then something changes. The money goes away and the cycle starts again. Second theme. Starting with the beginnings of schools in the third decade of the 20th century, we get this phenomenon really connected to a youth bulge of rise in school enrollments, and then 20 years later, look out. Because 20 years later, you get a lot of young men with new ideas, and those become revolutionaries of one sort or another. It has long been a buffer state, as I said. In the 19th century, it was regarded as a buffer state. Indeed, that's why it escaped being gobbled up during 19th century colonialism. The Russians didn't want the British to have it, and the British didn't want the Russians to have it, and neither the Russians nor the British wanted their empires bordering each other, and so, presto, voila, independent Afghanistan. In the 20th century, we have these kinds of balances. However, this system became either too complicated or, for whatever reason, really breaks down in the 1980s, which is the origins of the direct crisis. So here's this theme to note. Right? This slide comes here today, and since this lecture is going to cover part of the Afghan history, and then we'll go on and continue this all the way down to yesterday in Afghanistan. And this slide is also something that we'll look at again at the end of our examination of Afghanistan. But notice this theme. There's a collapse of the state, an explosion of conflict. And what happens? This leads outsiders of some kind. They are tempted to intervene, which sometimes they even invade. And what do? They do this. But then they find this country inhospitable, fundamentally ungovernable. So then they withdraw, and then internal conflict escalates again until some Afghan group establishes some kind of order, but which this, again, often offends outside powers, so they intervene again, and the cycle starts again. You can see this over and over and over again in the modern history of Afghanistan. From an Afghan point of view, their outside friends have long been recognized as a big part of their problem. Here's a cartoon way back from 1878 of the Afghan saying, "Save me from my friends," the Afghan in the middle caught between the Russian bear and the British lion. Now, so we need to understand those kinds of dynamics, the interpenetration of the dynamic of a weak state, the process of state formation, rentier money from these outsiders who come in, make a mess, decide to leave, things fall apart, that kind of process. We also need to understand more about the indigenous internal society. To do this, we have to talk about ethnic groups, in quotes. As usual, these are constructed identities. Everything is constructed, everything has causes, nothing, reject essentialism whenever possible. These ethnicities arise in interaction with the process of state formation and consolidation, in interaction with economic changes, and there are quite a lot of these in Afghanistan. Here's one simple map that says, well, here's a rough guide to the ethnic groups in Afghanistan. There are 4 of them that will mainly concern us. The big one, the Pashtuns, maybe half the population, in brown. Another very important one in light green called Tajiks. Then there are the folks in red, Uzbeks, and last but not least, the Hazaras in yellow in the center. And there are others. Now, not only do these people conceive of themselves as different, they also speak different languages. Pashtuns speak Pashto. Right? These folks, Tajiks and others, Hazaras, speak a dialect of Persian. These languages are not mutually intelligible. Uzbeks speak a Turkic language, which is not related in any way to any Indo-European language, and so you get a sense of just a little light taste of the complexity of this place. Who are these folks? Let's talk about the Pashtuns briefly first. Now, nobody knows the percentages of the population because, as you can imagine, with a state that isn't very strong, with very strong local authorities, and a country ravaged by war for a generation, there hasn't, to put it mildly, been any very accurate recent censuses. So we don't really know. But a reasonable guess is between 40% to 50% of the population of Afghanistan are Pashtuns. There are many of them on both sides of the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. As we will see later, nothing whatsoever about modern Afghanistan can be connected in isolation from developments in Pakistan. Okay? Since the 19th century, as we'll see later today, they have dominated the central state of Afghanistan. They were and remain the core support for the Taliban, and they are also simultaneously at the very top of the leadership of the current Afghan state. Hamid Karzai is himself a Pashtun. However, many Pashtuns don't think much of Mr. Karzai, and one of the reasons they don't is that we will see in Operation Enduring Freedom, as George Bush was pleased to call our moves into Afghanistan, the state that was installed had a very Tajik flavor. Who are these Tajiks? As I say, they speak a dialect of Persian. They have very strong connections with Central Asia. There is a Tajik republic carved out of the former Soviet Union. They were the core of a group called the Northern Alliance. We'll talk more about them. They were the folks who were defeated by the Taliban, but they were enemies of the Taliban. Okay? Who are the Uzbeks? Turkic speakers, very strong connections to Central Asia. These are Tamerlane's guys. Part of the Northern Alliance, this man, we'll talk more about him, General Rashid Dostum, a classic locally based power wielder. And again, you could just tell by looking at him, again, not the kind of guy that if he was mad at you, you would want to turn, you would want to keep, if you were around him, you would want to keep your back to the wall at all times. Okay? Who are the Hazaras? The legend is that they are the descendants of the soldiers of Genghis Khan. They look much more Asian than other local Afghans, and this is the local legend. Nobody's really sure. More importantly, they are largely Shia Muslim. The rest of the folks in Afghanistan are largely Sunni. They were oppressed and attacked, as we will see in the 19th century, during the process of the formation of a centralized state. They then became a kind of underclass. They have close ties with Iran, unsurprisingly, since they're Shi'i. They were part of the Northern Alliance. They were persecuted and massacred by the Taliban. They loathe, despise, and hate the Taliban. You can read it in The Kite Runner, for example, the novel and the movie. One of the main characters is a Hazara. This conflict between Pashtuns and Hazara has all kinds of consequences. The late Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States, Tip O'Neill, once said that all politics is local. This is true in Afghanistan as well as everywhere else. When the Taliban blew up the giant statues of the Buddha carved into the rock in Bamiyan after they blew it up, some of this was driven by religious fanaticism, but some of it was also a way to demonstrate their power and stick it in the face of the Hazaras who live around there and who thought, oh, this is kind of cool. This is our local monuments. So it was partly a local phenomenon. So, landlocked place, arid place, mountainous place, poor place, but also invaded episodically by foreigners. But you can see the geography makes it very hard to stick there. But you can also see that the state is weak. So local powers are strong. So what, if anything, could unite such a place? Well, one idea would be using religion. Historically, Islamic law and the Islamic clergy, the ulama, really in Arabic, it's the equivalent of rabbis, teachers. They're teachers. Okay? provided some mechanisms to conciliate feuding groups. I mean, after all, if you've got these different groups that are going to be constantly fighting each other because there is no central state, because we've got anarchy, because we've got honor codes, we've got all these things we already know about, well then, how are you going to solve conflicts? Well, there are lots of ways. There are established tribal and ethnic ways. But typically you needed some kind of neutral guy who would sort of say, okay, you sit there now, let's work out a deal. And those people were often the Islamic teachers. They also used Islamic appeals periodically to mobilize bigger coalitions for wars, and this is particularly useful if the foreigners aren't Muslim, if they're British, if they're Russian, if they're American. It's very useful to mobilize and unite otherwise disunited people by saying, yo, here come these foreigners, here come these infidels, let's kick them out of here. So, we need to talk about the process of external power, state formation, and social change. In other words, what we've done so far is we've got the elements, we've got the analytical pieces. Now we've got the X-ray, we've got the snapshot. Now, what we want to do is run the movie, just like before. Right? Same thing with oil. Start off, when you analyze things in terms of historical social science, first you get these categories, which themselves come out of history. But then you use them as you go through the history, trying to understand what is going on. Okay, let's see. Early history of a modern state. There's a power in Iran, the folks who made all of Iran Shi'i, ruled for over 200 years. And at the height of their power, they tried, and with some success initially, pushed the Pushtun tribes to make a big confederation. But then they revolted. Classic case. Outsiders come in, try to consolidate a state, works briefly, locals revolt. New ruler emerges from these tribal forces. But then there's a new outsider, the Sikhs, in India, in the Punjab. And they come in and seize the city of Peshawar. Okay, it's in Pakistan now, but it was largely a Pushtun place. And this leads to the loss of external revenue, which leads to state collapse. Regional powers come in, there's more conflict. All this even before the British get there. But then, of course, the British arrive. And we get the rise of what historians of the 19th century called the Great Game. This was British historians calling it the Great Game. What's the Great Game? The competition between the Russian Empire and the British Empire in India in all the areas in between. Okay? Rudyard Kipling's novel Kim is all about this particular phenomenon. There's a simple dynamic here. The British Empire expanded in India, but at the same time, the Russians are expanding into Central Asia. Each side was, to put it mildly, hostile and suspicious of the other side, and this was what was called the Great Game, as agents of both sides roamed around, having wild adventures, typically getting themselves killed. Okay? And this resulted in occasional intermittent intervention in Afghanistan. Now here's a man who, just for fun's name, you really need to remember, Lord Elphinstone. Lord Elphinstone is an absolute pristine icon of imperial incompetence and delusion. Arguably, this incompetence and delusion was not equaled again by foreigners in the region until the presidency of George Walker Bush. What did he do? Well, we have the first Anglo-Afghan War. The British were obsessed with Russian expansion into Central Asia. They were afraid, grossly implausibly. I mean, the Russians were literally several thousand miles away, hundreds of miles away, hundreds and hundreds, way, way back across vast deserts, but nevertheless, they were going to come in and invade India. Right? Delusions. This threat is right at the gates. So the British went in and marched a set of soldiers into Afghanistan and occupied the capital of Kabul. And at first, this was okay for a season. Then winter began to fall, and more British troops were getting stabbed in the suits, and people began taking pot shots at them, and calls for jihad began to emanate from the mosques. Afghan resistance, in short, began in typical Afghan style, and this got hotter and hotter, and the British position became untenable, and so the British were forced to withdraw. And so withdrawal they did. They retreated in January. It's really cold in January in Afghanistan. It's way up in the mountains. No ocean air coming in. It's very cold. They were here in Kabul. They're trying to get through the Khyber Pass to get into areas controlled by British India. And so they set off on these roads until they came to this little pass right here, a place called Gandamak. And in Gandamak, a painting hanging in a regimental hall in Britain to this day, they were surrounded and made a last stand where all but 6 men were killed. 5 of the 6 died in captivity. 1 guy, count him, 1 guy, 1 Brit, was sent out on a horse by the Afghans saying, go back to India, leave us alone. Get the message? Stay out of here. Okay? He arrived as the sole survivor of an army of 16,500 soldiers and civilians who went in. There were many women came in as well, wives of the officers. They all vanished. They disappeared. No one ever heard of any of these people again. They were wiped out. Okay? This was the first invasion of Afghanistan. But of course, never fear, for after a while, we have got the Maxim gun, which they have not, and things begin to go a little differently. But it's well to remember the brilliant command of Lord Elphinstone when you think about this. So here it is again, entangled in this great game. In this period, there was a conference in Berlin to try to keep the European balance of power from falling apart. And the king of Afghanistan received a delegation from Russia. Britain said, oh, you can't do that. And he said, yes, I can. And so the British invaded, and jihad was declared against the invaders, the usual thing. But it was a mixed outcome. Why? 2 reasons. One, the British didn't try to occupy the place. They had learned this is a bad idea. And they also had, of course, by now, superior military technology. So they could go in and then get out. They didn't want to stay. What they wanted was a buffer state. Okay? But the Afghans lost control of their foreign policy, and this would matter for later developments. And most importantly, the British decided that they were going to decide what's the boundary between this state of Afghanistan, whose foreign policy we'll basically control, and British India. We need a border. So they hired a man named Sir Mortimer Durand. And Sir Mortimer Durand, a surveyor, a famous surveyor, was hired to draw a line between British India, now Pakistan, and Afghanistan. This is the origin of the so-called Durand line, which is shown this little green line here, which separates Afghanistan from Pakistan. And notice, please, there are Pashtuns on both sides of this line. So the line went right through the Pashtuns. You can imagine that some Pashtuns didn't agree with this, and this will have consequences for later. You will also notice that if you are a state governing this country with this number of Pashtuns, you're going to care an awful lot about what goes on here in Afghanistan. And this will be the case for Pakistan, and Pakistan will have many reasons to be very, very concerned about what goes on inside of Afghanistan. Let's talk about early modern state formation in this late 19th century period. This man, the Iron Amir Abdurrahman Khan, he's a Pashtun. After the British got out, he seized power. And he tried to create a state in a way that we recognize from European and Asian history. To consolidate a state with lots of local power wielders, basically what you do is you go out and you try to kill them. And you try to maintain, and you're trying to create a monopoly on violence in your own hands. And this is itself a very, very violent process. He tried to do this also ideologically. He tried to make Sunni Islam, not the tribe, the basis of the legitimacy of the state. He imposed taxes. He tried to create an army of conscripts. Why is that important? Because then they'll depend only on him. They won't depend on local power wielders. Sound familiar? It should. It's exactly the same process that happened in Europe, exactly the same process that happened in Japan or China, or fill in the blank. So he begins to try to do this. The history of the Iron Emir is a classic case of state-making as organized crime. He launched, after all, if Sunni Islam is going to be the basis of the state, the Hazaras, who are Shi'i, have got to go. They revolt against him several times, and he massacres them, and he expels them, and he tries to destroy their institutions. He sells many of them into slavery, and he takes Pashtuns and settles them in formerly Hazara lands. If you look at a more detailed ethnic map of Afghanistan, which you can easily get online, you'll see, although the Pashtuns are concentrated in the south, you'll see pockets of them around in the rest of the country. You say, where did they come from? Answer, here. This is where they came from. They came from this process of state formation. And who do many of these people support today? Surprise, surprise, the Taliban. So here he is. And, of course, history always has a very long arm. The Hazaras and the Pashtuns to this day really don't get along. So here he is, the Iron Emir. He also moved against the Pashtun tribes. Not as violently, but again, we can understand why. It's the typical logic of state formation. He forcibly converted the last non-Muslims to Islam. These were people who lived way up in the Pamir, way up sort of where China and Tibet and Pakistan and Tajikistan all come together. Notice this. Making a state in a place like this is hard work. He faced 40, count them, 40 uprisings. 10 of these were very large, and 4 civil wars as different groups allegedly supporting him began to fight. His son, who took power after his death, this is the only non-violent transfer of political power in the history of modern Afghanistan. It's the only one. None others. Sounds like a hospitable place for Jeffersonian democracy, wouldn't you think? Yeah, no doubt. Maybe not. Let's look at the usual suspect for the modern state. You need an army dependent on you. You need a bureaucracy, people who will collect taxes. So that means you need people to train those folks. But where do you get them? You don't have local teachers, so you bring in foreigners. What kind of foreigners? Well, you want them to be Muslims. Where did you get them? You get them from Muslims from India, and you get them from the Ottoman Empire. And so you bring in these foreigners, and you start this process of trying to create a modern state, but you have 2, 3 huge problems. You don't have much revenue that you can lay your hands on. You have this very vociferous society with heavily armed locals who are looking for the slightest opportunity to shoot at you and your folks. And last but not least, you have this constant intervention by outsiders. It was and remains quite a balancing act. Further foundations. Trying to create a modern state, trying to create roads and schools and hospitals, all the usual trappings of what a modern state and a modern society look like. What do you do this? There is this king who took over peacefully. He brings in an advisor, a man named Mahmoud Tarzi, and both of these men were devoted and dedicated modernizers. They wanted education for women, they wanted school systems, they wanted to improve agriculture, they wanted all these kinds of things. They also, the king in particular, wanted greater independence from the British. He wanted his foreign policy back. And, given the weakness of the British, they attacked across the Durand line. The British bombed the Afghans. The British cut off money to him. That's a problem, because where does he get revenue? He doesn't have much tax base. He doesn't have many tax collectors. He tries to impose taxes. You know how popular that is in any society. People resist this. He also sets up for the first time some high schools, 3 of them, elite schools in Kabul, to begin to train people. And he tries to reform the army. He tries to no longer rely on locals. The locals resent this, and you get an army revolt. You get resistance by local leaders. Again, all of this perfectly classic, completely fits the mold of what we've already looked at in the case of Europe and Asia. Very similar. Again, photographs sometimes tell you a lot. Here's a photograph of King Amanullah and Mahmoud Tarzi, his advisor, and his wife. Notice the Western dress. Notice this guy dressed in sort of Russo-German kind of officer garb. This man dressed like a gentleman. from the late 19th century. And this man was much influenced by the Young Turks in Turkey, the Turkish nationalists. His wife was a Syrian. They introduced newspapers and the novel, and again, typically for modernizers in Afghanistan, they died in exile in Istanbul. They were kicked out because this kind of pressure of a centralizing state trying to change the mores of the country has historically provoked strong backlashes on the part of this vociferous, heavily armed, locally based system. Another recurring theme, we see this over and over and over again in the history of Afghanistan. Several rebellions whose names we don't really need to remember, but again, it's the usual story. An interweaving of local powers with ethnic resistance, leading in 1929 to Pashtuns coming in and sacking the city. What sack means is people, armed men, come in and they kill anybody and rape any woman that they want, and they take everything in the city. They destroy the city. They wreck the place. That's what it means. I mean, sack is kind of sounds, kind of like a sack. You put we're talking extreme violence here. And this war also pitted Tajiks against Persians. Okay? Against Pashtuns. Again, a recurring kind of theme. Some historians think of this as a kind of revenge of the mullahs. Again, something we'll see again in the last generation. These modernizing reforms that might make sense to us, but to some locals say, whoa, wait a minute. What are you doing? You're trying to supplant our locally traditional modes of education and so on, and then the mullahs get together and join up with the tribal groups in order to form a conflict. Again, weak state, complicated society, and very, very complicated conflicts. But one key is looking at these dynamics of state formation and then inability to hold it, local resistance. This is a recurring theme in history. Well, after all this mess, we get a king. He actually rules for a long time by Afghan standards, for a whole 40 years. His name was Mohammad Zahir Shah. He died a few years ago in exile in Rome. He made an alliance with the merchants. He basically understood that, look, I can't over-centralize, or this will never work, but I also need tax revenue. And I can get money from two places. One is, I can try to foster the ability of these people to sell things abroad. This isn't in the 1930s so much, but starting in the 1950s, they begin to be able to export things. And the global economy is growing, and there are some things, at least some modest revenue is available. He also invited in foreigners, particularly Americans and also Russians, to give a lot of aid money. And the idea was to build dams and irrigation works in those valleys so that there would be more output, more agricultural produce, people would be happier, merchants would be richer, and there'd also be more tax revenue. He was heavily reliant for all of this on foreign aid. It was a rentier state, not rentier state dependent on oil, but rentier state dependent on foreign aid. Okay? And this has been a recurring theme in the history of Afghanistan. They got aid from both sides in the Cold War. They maintained official neutrality and got the Americans to give money, and the Soviets to give money. Now, there was a kind of division of labor. We focused on education and development, and the Soviets focused on the military. We'll see what happened as a result of this. Over the weekend, I sent you a link to the New York Times where they recently revived an article reminding us once again of Truman. That except for the history we don't know, there isn't anything new. Here's an article from 1960. Mistakes beset Afghan project. The Helmand Valley work lags badly. Notice this statement in that article. A major fault in American planning is that the human element was overlooked. We tend to do this, we Americans. That's why we're so grotesquely ill-suited to running around and telling other people how to govern themselves. All right, let's look at the Pakistan connection. As I said, nothing can be understood without understanding this. Two key dates. First date, foundation of Pakistan itself. This was part, of course, of the end of British colonialism in India. It was, of course, a very violent event in which locals massacred each other. But before that happened, before partition, as it was called, there was an option. There was an election. People could vote in different regions. What, do you want to join India or do you want to join Pakistan? But the Pashtuns in what became Pakistan thought there should have been a third choice. How about independence? How about Pashtunistan becomes an independent country, and this then becomes a source of a kind of ethno-nationalism among the Pashtuns, something that will continue to be a force. Second key date, 1971, when East Pakistan, now called Bangladesh, seceded. This secession was at first brutally suppressed by the Pakistani military, but the Pakistani military was then easily trounced by the Indian military, and Pakistan became independent. What were the consequences? First, Pakistan is smaller and understandably much more worried about separatism, including the separatism of Pashtuns. They are weaker, they are poorer. This is the era of the oil boom in oil prices, and they are an oil importer. Millions of Pakistanis went to work in the Gulf, and that was good. They sent back money, but the oil price increase hammered the Pakistani economy. They need money. Who will give them money? Answer, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis begin giving them. And last, but hardly least, there is an increase in the power of an organization called the ISI, the Internal Pakistani Intelligence Service. All of these things were a consequence of 1971. Now, think about how the world looks from the point of view of a Pakistani security plan. India is, to put it very mildly, much larger and much stronger than Pakistan. And the origins of the state in Pakistan, as we'll see later, go all the way back to the 1850s, when the British suppressed a revolt and then began systematically discriminating against Muslims in India. And so the truth is that this is a very long-standing conflict. When American security folks say, well, the Pakistanis should just change their strategic orientation, it's sort of like, well, good luck with that. That's really very deeply rooted historically. And they fought 3 wars in India. They fought a war during partition. There was a war in 1965 and again in 1971, and India easily has won all 3 of them. So Pakistan loathes, hates, and fears India, meaning Pakistan, meaning the security elite of Pakistan. They therefore perceive Afghanistan as their strategic depth against India. This is absolutely crucial to their thinking. They certainly don't want any government in Afghanistan that is, in their eyes, too friendly with India, because then they're caught between the Indians, this giant power to their east, and their backs, which they think then if the Indians are too strong. So this will matter. They want a weak and pliable Afghan state dominated by their friends, the Pashtuns, provided those Pashtuns aren't nationalists in the sense of wanting an independent Pashtunistan. How do you do this? Well, you can do a lot of dirty tricks, and you can do a lot of manipulation, and you can use money if you can get it, which you certainly can from the Saudis for this purpose. But you also are going to need some ideological resources to do this, and Islamism is a most useful tool to pursue all of these goals. So, that's the Pakistan dimension. We will come back to this. Nothing can be understood about this place without understanding the Pakistanis. Now, we've seen that we have a weak rentier state. What about these rentier revolutionaries? Where did they come from? How are we to understand them? Let's talk about the rise of counter-elites in Afghanistan. Well, once again, remember, in history, there are always unintended consequences. And as my good friend Professor Peter Kinez in the history department often likes to say, no good deed will go unpunished. we helped expand the school system, which meant that increasing numbers of educated or semi-educated Afghan youth from village backgrounds were produced, and the leaders of both Islamists and Marxists came out of this group. Right? And both of them together would help blow up the country of Afghanistan, creating the basis, when blended in with the Cold War, for first Soviet intervention and then American intervention. It can be traced all the way back to this. As Rubin says, these revolutionary ideologies, very different revolutionary ideologies, but both revolutionary ideologies that these young men embraced, were radical responses by elites that were trained for a world that they cannot join. Let's talk about the Marxists first. Like the Islamists, they mostly came from rural and middle-class backgrounds, and they were educated at the elite university in Kabul University. The Soviets had consistently supported Pushtun nationalism, and a party whose flag is shown there was largely Pashtuns, but also there were Tajiks and Uzbeks. And now what we're going to see in a little bit is that for both the Marxist revolutionaries and the Islamist revolutionaries, just as the state itself and the society is riven with all these ethnic and other fissures, the same thing is true of the revolutionaries. There will be different factions of Marxists, and they will hate each other, and they will fight with each other, and they will kill each other. And there will be different factions of Islamists, and they will hate each other, and they will fight with each other, and they will kill each other. And all this will interweave with foreign intervention and the process of state formation, all creating a most obnoxious and deadly witches' brew. Let's talk about the Islamists. Who were they? Similar, but slightly different. In the first place, they went into two kinds of schools, also in Kabul. As is typical throughout the Arab world, they went to two kinds of faculties. One was religious law. That might make sense. The other was engineers. Islamists throughout the Arab and Muslim world, often many engineers support Islamists. That is, a modernizing ideology that is yet consistent with their own conception of their own traditions. What was their social background? They were all provincials, but notice for later reference, and by contrast with the Taliban, these were middle-class, relatively well-off folks. So the original Islamists come out of middle-class backgrounds, relatively prosperous by local standards, and this, as we will see, will be radically different from the origins of the Taliban. They were somewhat less Pushtun-dominated than the Marxists. They were not coming out of the traditional Muslim ulama. It was these young, relatively well-off village boys who go to the city and educate, something that is very similar to the studies that are done about the origin of Islamists in Egypt. Very similar kind of phenomenon. They had international links, just as the Marxists had international links. In the case of the Marxists, those links were with Soviets. In the case of the Islamists, their links were often with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, but they, too, were riven by splits. Pashtuns against Tajiks, and then ideological splits as well, quite a mess. So that's the situation in the early 1970s. And now, things are going to start going seriously south. The gathering storm. What happens? By the early 1970s, as a result of the local youth bulge and a weak state, dependent on aid that comes and goes, depending on the whims of outsiders, you get increasing unemployment and discontent among the educated. The oil boom has a particular effect because there are big bucks available in Iran, which launches a gigantic spending spree. Huge construction projects, and the Hazara, who speak a dialect of Persian, so they can communicate in Iran, and they're also Shi'i. They go and they make a lot of money, and they come back, and the Pashtuns resent this, because these are supposed to be, these are the inferior guys, right? That's the way people thought locally, and so they come back with this money, and they are resented. Then there's a famine, a crop failure, and then combined with mismanagement, There's nothing will quite delegitimize a government like the inability to provide food in a crisis. And in 1973, a prince, a member of the royal family named Daoud, launched a coup, deposed Zahir Shah, and proclaimed a republic. And here he is, Mohammed Daoud Khan, who one could probably say had pretty good intentions. And we know all about the paving on the road to hell. And nevertheless, he did have good intentions. He promoted a series of modernizing reforms. He wanted things to get better in Afghanistan. He was also a Pushtun nationalist, which would make him popular with some Pashtuns, but of course not really much of a sell among Hazars and Tajiks. He sought to distance himself from the communist allies. He had a lot of allies who were communists, who were in the military, in the officer corps. But at the same time, he's getting all this military aid from the Soviets, and Soviet officers are coming in and out, and these guys are also agents. So, of course, there's a very strong communist, Marxist component of the military. He then attacks the Islamists. In other words, he begins to make the classic mistake of a politician who thinks he can attack everybody. If you attack everybody, you will die, because you will have no more friends, and there will be no one there to help defend you when all the people that you have outraged come to slit your throat. Okay. And this is the way it works in this part of the world. This is the way it works in Europe. This is the way it works. This is the way politics, at the fundamental core level of establishing a monopoly on violence, I am sorry to say, it is the way it goes. So he suppressed the Islamists, and what do? They flee to Pakistan. And as we will see, the local Prime Minister of Pakistan, a former general who was himself a dedicated Islamist, will start helping them. He tried to improve relations with Iran, still under the Shah. The Shah offers money for a railroad. The Pakistanis get very suspicious. If they have a railroad through Iran, they won't have to depend on trucking routes that go into Pakistan. That's not good for us. We worry about this. Maybe the Iranians will be friendly with the Indians. We don't like this so much. In any case, he offended everyone. He's overthrown and murdered in April 1978 by communist officers. In this same event, one of the American ambassador was also trapped in his office and murdered as well. This is a really violent place. And then the Pushtun communists proceed to make a thoroughgoing mess of things. They call themselves, their flag there says in Farsi, Halk, which just means people, the People's Party, take over. They're based, however, on the Pashtuns. They launch a kind of terror campaign and a set of reforms that on paper look good. Land reform, education of women. But what this basically meant was going in to villages where you didn't know anybody, often didn't even speak the language, and then saying, okay, we're taking away your land, and well, we'll just rip this veil off your wife. That is outrageous. The locals, what are you doing? And who are these people anyway? And who are they to tell me what to do? It was a classic case, to put it in the language of sort of the history of Marxism, of what was called voluntarism or revolution from above. Instead of having a mass base, this was a revolution based on an elite group, which then sought to impose that revolution on the society rather than having it growing out of the society itself. Well, you can imagine what would begin to happen. The army begins to disintegrate. The Hazaras revolt and get autonomy. The Pakistanis are meddling. The place is in trouble. And the country is becoming destabilized. And this makes the Politburo in Moscow very, very nervous. They view this as a threat to their security interests. And now there's another piece of the Cold War, though, that we have to note. We now know that we were behind some of this as well. We know that we began providing aid to the exiled Islamist Afghans before the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. This is an important point to note. And this is the source, the man who ordered it. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. The first directive before the October invasion by the Soviets, secret aid to the opponents of Kabul, and they thought this was going to induce a Soviet military intervention. Just like Barnett Rubin says, okay, it was very much what happened to the hapless Afghans is a result of decisions made for the Cold War purposes that had nothing to do with them, and as a result of this, millions of them will have lives that will be ruined. Here's what Brzezinski said at the time of the interview with the French newspaper Le Nouvel Observateur. He said this. Note the date. This is in 1998. He said, well, they asked, well, do you regret this? And his response was, well, basically, certainly not. Faking them was an excellent idea. It drew the Russians into this trap. You want me to regret it? Some stirred up Muslims, like a man named Osama bin Laden. I mean, the citizens of Lower Manhattan might beg to differ about the wisdom of this particular thing. And note, the people who really paid the price were the Afghans. So the Soviets invaded. The government of Afghanistan asked the Soviets to send troops to help them against these Islamist rebels. The Soviets responded. First, they sent in small detachments. It's usually the way it works, right? First you go into small, and more, and more. And they went in force in December. They killed the president. He was a communist, but they thought, you're making a mess of things. And, you know, these are the heirs of Joseph Stalin. They weren't exactly gentle about this. And they installed their own guy, a local named Babrak Kemal. This little map shows the way they did it. They came in 2 ways. They came in with an airlift of paratroopers into the capital. And then this is the ring road that goes, this whole area is highly mountainous, but there's a kind of set of gaps, the ring road, which is the way that they came in. So the Soviets come into Afghanistan, outsiders intervening for reasons of their own, just like the British did 3 times before. Now it's the Soviets' turn, now it's the Russians' turn to come into Afghanistan to try to shore up their own rentier state. Typically, when this happens, there are people who say, you know, maybe this is a bad idea. And there were now, we know, thanks to the opening of the Soviet archives, we know that there were dissenters at the time. And one of the dissenters was not exactly a minor guy. This man, General Nikolai Olgarkov, was the chief of staff. He was basically like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Soviet Union. And he said, this could mire us in unfamiliar, difficult conditions and would align the entire Islamic East against us. I think you might have read something like that in commentary these days. I think. Notice. What did Brezhnev reply? Shut up, sit down, do your job. We know what we're doing. Oh, really? And so there was the creation of the latest stand. There's Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan. There's also Quagmirestan. Quagmirestan is where are the Soviets going into Quagmirestan. And now the war of the 1980s begins. First phase, 1980 to 85. The Soviets used massive, indiscriminate force. This had a number of consequences, not least the killing of many, many people. But we also want to track the socio-political consequences of the way the war was fought, because that then helps us understand what happens later. After all, if you think about it, where did the Taliban come from? Who are they? What are they doing? How do we understand this? Well, as usual, the only way to understand this is to understand modern history. And it starts with this. Massive indiscriminate use of force, which first creates a gigantic number of refugees, probably 5.5 million of them. Right? The local insurgents, the people who were these local powers trying to fight against the central state, which now is additionally a foreign power, additionally infidels, avowed atheists, communists, they get wiped out. Right? They can't resist this kind of firepower. They're the locals. And that means that their networks are severely impacted. So the resistance has to look to parties in exile if they want to resist the Soviets. The Soviets additionally 1983 to 85, targeted the infrastructure, just much as, in a way, we did in the Vietnam War. The idea, if you attack and sort of pollute the whole rural area, well, with poisons, then you'll drain the sea, the peasants will have to flee, we drain the sea, and then Mao Zedong's fish, the gorillas, can't swim in the sea because we drain the water, right? Yeah, well, this was hugely destructive, and it strengthened further the Islamist parties in exile. And we'll talk about that later. So here's a picture of Soviet soldiers fighting there, snipers, all kinds of activities, and refugee camps set up. Notice there are some in Iran, mostly Hazara, but also people from around Herat. But notice where they're concentrated. They're concentrated in Pakistan. Okay? And so again, a Pakistani connection. Now, what about the resistance? What about the Mujahideen, that is, those who waged jihad? We get a resistance that is not unified. We are not talking something like the National Liberation Front in Vietnam. We are not talking the National Liberation Front in Algeria. We're talking a whole set of different resistance movements, all independent, all jealous of each other, all reflections of this highly fragmented and vociferous society. Led by local warlords, there were 7 main ones and lots of smaller ones, all receiving aid from the Saudis, from the Americans, and from the Pakistani intelligence services. The Pakistanis, furthermore, for reasons of their own, didn't want these folks unified. And the decision on who got the money was basically being made by the ISI and the Saudis, and lots of private money from those very wealthy princes also pouring in. And the key innovation that we supplied were Stinger missiles, shoulder-held surface-to-air missiles, which in a war of ambush, which was the main tactic of the resistance of the Mujahideen, meant now for the first time, when the Mujahid get these things, they can neutralize the Soviet use of helicopters. In a country that's very rugged, in a country that's very mountainous, this is good for you. They can't come in with helicopters. They have to go on roads, and you can mine the roads, you can set up ambushes on the roads, and this makes it very difficult. Now, the Soviets were pretty clear about who was behind this. We were. Now, they could have really said, that's what it says in Russian, dirty work of the CIA in Afghanistan, but behind them were other folks, like the Saudis, like the Pakistanis, and so on. And the Soviets had an interesting experience. Here's a man, Marshal Akhrameyev, who was the commander in Afghanistan at the time, and he said, we always win the battles. We always win. But then, the next morning, it's just like there hadn't been a battle. The terrorists, as he calls them, terrorists, just like we do, they're back in the village, and we thought we destroyed them. Sound familiar? It was fragmented insurgency. There are various maps that show all these different groups of alliance to all these different leaders. Very, very split up. Who were some of these leaders? Let's talk about some of these folks. Here's one you may have heard of. His name is Gulbuddin Hikmatov. He's a Pushtun. He was kicked out of Kabul University for stabbing and murdering a Marxist student who he didn't like. This is the way it goes, folks. This is not the kind of society where everyone sits down and debates it, and says, well, your views, I'll take them into consideration. Not so much. Not really. Okay? This guy is also a hardline takfiri. Okay? He believes that if you don't agree with him, not only do I not like you, but you're also not a real Muslim. Guess who backed him? We did. We did. We and the Saudis and the ISI, he was favored throughout the war. Okay? What's he doing now? He leads a group that is fighting on the side of the Taliban against American forces. Gulbuddin Hikmatov. History has a long arm. Another guy, Jalaluddin Haqqani. He's another Pushtun. He again was generously supported by both us and the Saudis and the Pakistanis during the 1980s. He helped Osama bin Laden. He joined the Taliban rather later. People think he was responsible for massacres of Tajiks. He's now thought to be in Pakistan, and his group, called the Haqqani Network, is the second big group fighting Americans now inside of Afghanistan. We tried to kill him. We keep failing. He comes back. He's delegated stuff to his son. He has a number of sons. All of them sort of take after Dad. They're pretty tough. They keep fighting. Then there's another man, a Tajik, named Ahmed Shah Massoud. He was educated at Kabul. He was, by all accounts, possibly the most brilliant military strategist among the Mujahideen. He made the Panjshir Valley up in northern Afghanistan essentially a no-go zone for the Soviets because he kept ambushing them every time they'd come in. He became the leader of the Northern Alliance and became an enemy of the Taliban, and he was assassinated 2 days before 9/11, which was deliberate. It was an Al-Qaeda operation designed to remove the best military leader of the Northern Alliance because they knew, indeed something, they hoped that in the wake of 9/11 the United States would invade Afghanistan. Last guy, Ismail Khan, he's still around. He was an early rebel against the communists. His power is based out here in the West, and he has very good ties with Iran. He's kind of didn't like the Taliban, fought against them, friendly with the government, not fighting against the Americans, although he does not think that we have an exceptionally bright future in Afghanistan. Last guy, a man named Sayyaf, he's another Pushtun, typical background. He's a Wahhabi, very generously supported by the Saudis. His troops, again, you see this kind of recurring theme. Takfiris, Sunni Takfiris, don't like the Shia, Hazara is a Shia, there are these massacres back and forth. He was close to bin Laden, but he also worked with the Northern Alliance. So, it is in this violent mess that global jihad originates. It is part of its origins. We've seen other parts. We've seen the way it originated in the history of Islamism in a previous lecture. But now, specifically in Afghanistan, we can see what happens. This invasion outraged Sunni Islamists. And we know that there was an extensive network of Muslim brothers from Egypt in Saudi Arabia who'd been there for a generation. And this oil wealth is then used to fund projects and institutions designed to help the Mujahideen. Some of this was perfectly legitimate. A lot of this is, refugees. You got 5.5 million of these people. You got to feed them. Pakistan's a poor country, so they would set up various welfare programs. But of course, we've also seen those same welfare programs can be used as ways to further your political ideology. They also help facilitate a kind of equivalent of what happened during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s of the so-called international brigades, when young men on the left all over the world volunteered to join forces to fight for the Spanish Republic against the fascist forces under General Franco. This was an Islamist international brigade, sort of young men from all over the world volunteering to join to fight in Afghanistan. They're mostly important not so much during the fight against the Soviets as after the Soviets get out. Okay? But they were there. And where did they start? They started with this man, a man named Abdullah Azam. He was a Palestinian. Anyone who tells you that the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians doesn't have anything to do with the problems in the Middle East, well, is one of two things. They are either a fool or an idiot. He was a mentor of bin Laden. He set up and managed a network to put foreign jihadis in touch with locals, especially with Hekmatyar, he of the stabbing the Marxist student thing. He was funded by bin Laden and lived by the sword, died by the sword. He was mysteriously assassinated in 1989. Here's the house where Osama bin Laden got started. It's called the Maktab al-Khidmat, an office of services, service office, funded by the ISI in Pakistan, in this house in Peshawar in Pakistan. It provided funding and support to Afghan and especially non-Afghan Mujahideen. Where did they come from? All over. They were Arabs, especially Algerians and Egyptians and Sudanese and Jordanians and Palestinians and Iraqis and Yemenis. But they were also Uzbeks from Central Asia. They were Chechens who've been fighting the Russian Empire since the 1820s and still haven't given up. They're Uyghurs from China. They're from all over the place. Here's a diagram that shows you the core. This is where the jihad in the 1980s, how it was fostered. And what happens in history is that everything has consequences. You do something in one period with goals of that period, but then you sow the dragon's teeth for later if you're not paying attention. So we have the Pakistani intelligence services, our own Central Intelligence Agency, and the Saudis all funding jihadis. One might add, some think there was also very discreet some money from the People's Republic of China here because they were also, of course, opposed to the Soviets. In all this, in Pakistan, there is an Islamist who is running the show. His name was Zahir Shah. He seized power in a coup. He was an Islamist. He strongly supported the Afghan jihad. He strengthened the Islamist parties in Pakistan, something that has come back to haunt the Pakistani state. He passed many, many laws that they liked. And again, he died in a plane crash in mysterious circumstances. It's everybody's favorite guessing game. Who killed him? Was it the Russians? Was it the Saudis? Was it the Iranians? Was it the Chinese? Was it the Indians? So many people who wanted him dead, it's really hard to say. The Soviets, under Gorbachev, realized that Afghanistan for them was a hemorrhaging wound that had no solution except withdrawal, and so in 1988 they pulled out. Reflecting on this later, this man, who is a Soviet, was a Soviet general, he's also a Chechen ethnically, he said when we entered, everybody liked us. A year later, 40% began to hate us, and then 60% of them hated us, and by the time we pulled out, about 90% of them hated us. We need to pay attention to this. So what's left behind? There are these things called tank graveyards in Afghanistan. These old Soviet tanks that are rotting and rusting and having snow fall on them. They're just going to sit there, abandoned. This is what happened during the Soviet invasion. 15,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, about. Over 50,000 were wounded, mostly seriously. Maybe 1 million Afghans were killed. That's a lot of dead people to report from a very poor and backward country to help facilitate, because we think it makes strategic sense, and we created 5.5 million refugees. Notice one other thing, though. Just do the math. Look at the quotient. Numbers of Soviets killed divided by number of Afghans killed. And then say, and who won? Interesting. Looks like these Afghans are willing to fight for a very long time and seem willing to take absolutely unbelievable casualties to get rid of these foreign folks. Something we might consider. So the Soviets pull out. Now what? What a mess. Wrecked society. What happens next? Nothing good. First, as is often the case in history, there are roads not taken. This is a very important thing to remember. Inevitably, hindsight is 20/20, and hindsight also in history tends to look, the past looks more deterministic than it probably really is. You look back and you say, well, we can see all the reasons that led to this, but there were also other reasons where things might have gone differently. And here's an example. In February of 1989, Soviet troops are already out of the country. The Soviet foreign minister, the last one, Edward Shevardnadze, flew to Islamabad. First time any high-ranking Soviet official of that rank had been to Pakistan. What does he want to do? Persuade the Pakistani government to a temporary sharing of power between the Mujahideen and the communist, nominally communist, really just strongman thug, regime in Kabul. He hoped to prevent a civil war, and he hoped to lay the foundation. Actually, he understood that in the longer run, and not so long run, their guy would have to go, but they wanted this to be peaceful. They wanted to have some kind of relatively peaceful transfer of power. But humans are typically subject to impulses of revenge, and no good ever comes of that. because the ISI, together with the CIA backing, refused this offer. Ahmed Rashid, the great Pakistani journalist and student of Afghan affairs, wrote, the CIA wanted to celebrate a total debacle, no matter how many Afghan lives it would cost. A political compromise was not in the plans of either one, and this is the way it has been for centuries in the world. As Axel Oxenstierna said on his deathbed, "Know, my son, with how little wisdom the world is governed." And so was it then. So the deal isn't done. What's going to happen instead? Well, we simply walked away. We said, whoopee, hooray, we win, time to go home. Super Bowl's over, go to the parking lot, rev it up, drive home. We won. What's left behind is something that isn't really a state. You've got the same lack of a monopoly on violence, but now the highly competitive, instead of having an economic language, instead of having a monopoly, we have a competitive market. And this competitive market, every single actor has extraordinarily lethal firepower, hyper-armed networks of power, multiple locally based groups who then launch a devastating power struggle to see who will come out on top. In some regions, you get local warlords. In others, nobody's in charge at all, and you get something approaching anarchy. What happens? This man was Najibullah. He was the guy in Kabul. He was the backed by the Soviets. But by now, he was a very pragmatic guy. He says, I'll do a deal, any deal. After the Soviets, many Afghans said, okay, the foreigners are gone. Jihad's over. We got rid of them. They're gone. They're leaving us alone. This guy, oh yeah, he's a bad guy. But he's an Afghan at least. Even if he claims he's not a Muslim, that's not probably really not true. And so what? Leave him alone. So a lot of them just quit fighting. They tried to change their name. You know, communist, quick, get rid of that label. No. Call ourselves something else. And they weren't trying to change society. They were basically trying to buy people off. They were trying to survive. But the more ideological folks, like Mr. Hekmatyar and Mr. Saud, fought on. They didn't want to quit. They had a very strong ideological goal. And remember, these are the guys backed by Pakistani intelligence services who disposed of ample money from the Gulf, from Saudi Arabia. Oil rents were flowing into their hands. And we want these communists overthrown. Okay? The Arab Afghans, this is the time when this sort of proto-Al-Qaeda group, this sort of Islamist international brigade, begins to become a more important player. And so, along will come 1991, when the Soviet Union finally falls. But for 3 years, this regime had missiles, they had militias, they had the support of a general, an Uzbek, General Dostum, a cigar-smoking, whiskey-drinking, very tough guy up in the north, and he supported this regime. We wanted to humiliate the Soviets, we wanted revenge for Vietnam. There was an unsuccessful siege by Islamists of Jalalabad. It was fought off, looked like a stalemate, but once the Soviet Union collapses for good, the regime has no more money, they can't support the militias desert them, General Dostum flips over and joins the other side, and the regime itself is debating, and so we have the destruction of the capital city of Kabul. There's a race to the city to see who'll take it. Massoud's heavily armed and well-trained and led folks coming down from the north, Hekmatyar's guys coming in from the south and east, and General Dostum's men cooperating with Ahmed Shah Massoud's and the Tajiks. Hekmatyar had more forces, but Massoud's were much better armed. They'd seized huge quantities of armaments from the Soviets and Afghan garrisons that surrendered. And there was brutal, enormously destructive fighting that took place. Hekmatyar's forces first seize the city, they're then driven out, they then camp outside the city and fire rockets into the city. It was a brutal mess. Here's Massoud, the Tajik, fighting with Hekmatyar, the Pushtun, and Dostum, the Uzbek. from a local Afghan cartoon. Until the arrival of the Taliban, there was very basically no government in Afghanistan. It was a period of essentially something approaching anarchy for about 5 years. That's a long time in modern history. These were the main players. There was no political resolution, only carnage, and this is what Kabul looked like. It was a ruin. It looks like Richmond after Grant burned it to the ground, right? It's a mess. There's howling wilderness, the presidential palace, not looking very spiffy. The city had been wrecked. So we had anarchy. Power networks, all fighting each other. No lasting government established. Some places, like Herat off in the east, relatively isolated, close to Iran, local power wielder, Ismail Khan, friendly with Iran, some kind of basic semblance of order is established locally. And different depends on where you are. There are various local. But around in the south, around the city of Kandahar, just anarchy. What were they doing? Well, they were plundering, looting, raping, burning. Well, these are warlords. Right? This is what warlords do. This sets the stage for the rise of the Taliban. This is where the Taliban comes from. But before we talk about that, just say another thing about what was the consequence of this Cold War between the Americans with our Saudi and Pakistani allies and Islamist allies against the Soviets with their local Afghan communists. Well, the army of Afghanistan had disintegrated altogether. Everyone in the country was very heavily armed. Human capital, anyone with any education got out as quickly as they could, or if you didn't, you would die. Economic infrastructure, including roads, were extensively damaged. The only thing that wasn't, the Pakistani wanted the Mujahideen to blow up a huge dam, but the Mujahideen refused. It was at that kind of level. 50% of the population were displaced, not all of them into Pakistan, although maybe 5.5 million of them, but others displaced internally. So the whole society is churned up and local networks are undermined. People are desperate, so they're looking for aid from anyone who might be willing to give it. Orchards were blown up, chopped down, trashed. Irrigation works were done in. Deforestation was extensive, and the population was extensively politicized. The cash economy began to revive because, after all, if you don't have any mineral resources, if you don't have any oil, if there's no order, if you have locally based groups of heavily armed young men who are essentially thugs, and how would they not be, given their life experience, who have known only violence, what cash crop would have a very high value per unit land and per unit weight? And the answer is drugs, opium. Okay? And this is what happens. So there was created, through this complex process, a culture of war. Afghan rugs are famous, and in the refugee camps in Peshawar, children made rugs in which they wove Soviet attack helicopters and Kalashnikov assault rifles into traditional patterns, as in this example shown here, making rugs as a way to sell. The people were deracinated, pulled out. There were many of them living in squalid refugee camps. A whole generation of Afghans grew up with essentially no knowledge of anything except war. And they were educated in these camps in particular kinds of schools, certain kind of Islamic schools, followers typically of a particular form of Islam that comes out of India, that we'll talk about next. But as usual, these were staffed by Takfiri teachers, and as so often, William Faulkner is right. The past is not dead. It is not even past. What is it even past? How about the 1860s in India? Not even past, because there's a phenomenon called Deobandism, and it was these people who staffed these madrasas that were typically the ones that educated, to the extent we can call it education, these young men. This movement was founded in the 1860s in India. They have rigid, literal religious views
powerfully supported in Pakistan. Their headquarters is this place, the Darul Uloom Deoband, and where is it? It's in India, in Uttar Pradesh, and how right there. And how did it come to be? It was a response to British colonialism. The leaders who set this place up were the leaders of Islamic schools in Delhi that had been destroyed by the British after they violently suppressed the uprising of both Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims against the British in 1857. They were zealous, they wanted to educate people, and they had an intense hatred of British, and by extension other Westerners and other non-Muslim influences. As that article that I sent to you by the great British writer William Dalrymple talks about this, and how again this is being recapitulated today. So we have a country that is split into lots of different pieces, and it's a mess. Life expectancy at birth, an Afghan baby can expect to live to be about 46, which means infant mortality is huge. Less than 1 out of 3 Afghans can read and write. Children die per year in very large numbers. There are orphans all over the place. This was their inheritance. And they were overwhelmingly, many of them, in refugee camps. And as we will see, this is what sets the stage for where we will start next time with the rise of the Taliban. Talk to you on Thursday.